Hi everyone, I hope you're well. It would have been really nice to deliver this face to face on campus today, but we're living in very strange times. My name's Sara McDowell and I'm a human geographer and I'm also the course director of the geography programme at Ulster. And today I'm going to be presenting some material which you may find useful on ethnic diversity and conflict. So today I am going to be presenting some material on ethnic diversity and conflict in Myanmar. It has gained quite a lot of attention over the last couple of years due to the enforced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims from Rakhine State in the west of the country. And it's quite an interesting example to talk about some of those themes that come up in Section C of the A-level curriculum. So this is a case study that I actually use with my own students and I find that it works really well. So it's quite a rich case study and still very much evolving, so it's quite fresh and it gives us plenty of scope to talk about these things that are important in human geography, such as diversity, such as inequalities, such as nationalism, territoriality. All of that is going on in Myanmar and the students seem to get a lot from it. So hopefully today there might be some material for you to use in your own classrooms over the course of the next couple of years. The thing about this case study as well is that it intersects with some of the other issues that you're already delivering and that's on the curriculum. So the whole concept and topic of migration, so concentrating on that enforced migration of Rohingya Muslims. It intersects with cultural geography, so specifically how the construction of cultural landscapes conveys these really strong messages about who does belong and who doesn't belong. And also that theme that runs through all of this, such as socio-spatial inequalities. So Myanmar is a really good example of how inequality is very firmly tied to ethnicity and also to gender actually. Potentially it's a good case study that challenges to think a bit bigger about these big global issues that's going on globally and that's important to all of us as geographers as well. So, you know, that idea of there being this global refugee crisis and how do we plan for that and how do we deal with that? Issues surrounding inequality, development and sustainability. So I think there's lots of those issues that a case study in Myanmar can provide a really rich, some really rich material for exploring. Okay, so just to give some context before we look at issues surrounding diversity and conflict. So Myanmar has got a population of approximately 53 million, although some ethnic groups actually aren't counted. So to try and get a handle of the population can sometimes be difficult. It's got a very complex and turbulent history, and this has directly impacted how it's experienced both diversity and conflict. So it was a former British colony in the 1800s and it remained so until 1948. Independence was followed by a power struggle, as in the case of most colonial societies that are emerging and transitioning into an independent state. Usually there is a power struggle and a vacuum that leaves after the colonising country withdraws. So this happened in Myanmar. So in 1958, the military assumed power and established a dictatorship that lasted over 5 decades. Burma, as it was previously known, was renamed Myanmar by the military and it was cut off from the rest of the world. And this dictatorship was hugely oppressive and it was met by lots of resistance within Myanmar itself over the decades. In 2011, there was a move towards liberalisation and a move towards democracy. In 2015, finally, there was a series of free and fair elections. And in 2016, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was a former human rights icon, a real activist and a former Nobel Peace Prize recipient, was appointed as state councillor. So she heads up this de facto civilian government, but these close ties with the military also are retained. So there's this kind of uneasy relationship that makes the new democratic Myanmar quite fragile. So Myanmar is an interesting place in terms of its ethnic diversity and its development. So historically, Myanmar was one of the richest countries in Southeast Asia. It emerges from its military dictatorship after 2011 as one of the poorest. Quite an impoverished country in the a decade ago. So it was, and poverty was spatially expressed as well. So poverty acutely concentrated in the rural areas of Myanmar, and in 2011 less than a third of the country had access to electricity. So just to give you some context there of poverty and levels of development. So whenever it emerges from this dictatorship, there's a lot of political isolation. So globally, it had been cut off from the rest of the world for quite a long time. Very fearful of intervention, foreign intervention, due to its experience with colonialism, I suppose, also. Lots of economic underdevelopment, not a good healthcare system, low quality education, and low levels of social mobility. And what's interesting about this is that it's expressed very differently across the country. So acute levels of poverty and opportunity in some sections of the population. I just wanted to say something about the geography of Myanmar and how that influences its ethnic makeup also. So it borders, so it's quite a small country, but it borders with Bangladesh, India, Laos, China, and Thailand. And this sort of strategic position and all these borders influences its ethnic makeup. So it's very diverse because of all these border influences that surround it. Okay, so just to say some things about what ethnic diversity looks like in modern day Myanmar. So very, very diverse. It lists and documents over 135 ethnic groups, and they speak over 100 different languages. The geography, really, really interesting as well, because that actually contributes, its physical geography contributes to these strong ethnic minorities. So quite a rugged country in places, and that allows small ethnic groups to survive isolated in many regards for centuries, and that allows them to retain their cultural heritage and their cultural traditions and practices. So the diversity, as I've said before, is spatially expressed. So I've included a map here that lists some of those key ethnic groups. And you can see kind of just how that map looks there. So there's quite a bit of segregation, and they reside in different areas. Myanmar is divided into these 8 states, and they correlate with what the government in Myanmar call national races. There's very strong correlation between ethnicity and poverty in rural areas. So some of these ethnic groups, these minority ethnic communities, are very poor and haven't enjoyed some of the economic investment and opportunities as major ethnic groups in the country. So the largest ethnic group comes from the Bamar community, the Burmese, as they're otherwise known, and they're largely Buddhist, and they hold political and cultural authority, and they represent around 68% of the population. So I wanted to say something about the origins of ethnic conflict before we talk about the specific example of the Rohingya Muslims. So it's largely accepted that a lot of the ethnic division and conflict that currently exist in contemporary Myanmar is a direct legacy of British colonial policy. So during the colonial period, Britain used a form of indirect rule to empower minority leaders. And they did that because they needed to control the border or peripheral states. And the majority of the Bamar who had been in power before in the pre-colonial era suffered a collapse in the traditional sort of powers and structures of authority. Burmese religious nationalism grew out of an effort to reassert power and identity in the wake of independence. So ethnic diversity was perceived to be a threat to this power. So when the military emerges as victorious, they are representing the Bamar, the Burmese Buddhist community. And ethnic diversity is seen to be a major threat to, this effort to establish power and authority. I think it's important to understand that we often frame conflicts as either, ethnic or religious, but in this context, you need to understand the impact and influence of British colonialism and how it impacted identity. So ethnicity in Myanmar sort of dictated the way in which conflict was experienced and continues to be experienced. And if we just think about ethnic conflicts a bit more, they're often rooted in the need for greater autonomy, control over natural resources, and there's other issues surrounding education, culture, religion, and language. We've witnessed in Myanmar lots of violence towards the Rohingya in recent years, and this is depicted and experienced as a religious conflict between the Buddhist nationalists and minority Muslims. So this brings us on to the Rohingya, and specifically the Rohingya Muslims. So the Rohingya have a presence in the region since the 15th century, and they trace their ancestry back to Arab traders, which came to the autonomous state of Arakan, that later becomes Rakhine State, alongside Bengalis in the pre-colonial period. So they have a long history in Myanmar, in the region that we now identify as Myanmar. The majority of the Rohingya are Muslim. There is a tiny percentage that are Hindu also. Rohingya Muslims represent the largest percentage of Muslims in Myanmar. Muslims represent are a minority of the population, so they only account for around 4%. And Buddhism accounts for nearly 90% of the population. So just to give some context there. The Rohingya largely live in Rakhine State in the west of the country, and again, geography comes into play when we think about marginalisation and inequality. So the state is geographically and physically isolated, so its residents live on these large coastal plains, and they're separated by a mountain range which cuts them off physically from the rest of Myanmar and the Naf River. The Rohingya have a really strong sense of identity, so they have their own language, which is a dialect of Bengali, and they have a whole series of cultural practices and traditions that differentiates them and gives them a really strong sense of an ethnic identity. Their marginalisation has got long roots in Myanmar, and it becomes quite acute after independence. So during the Second World War, so while Myanmar was still part of the British colony, Rohingya Muslims sided with the British during the Second World War. Some were quite hopeful of an independent state, so they wanted that Rakhine State to be independent. Some of their neighbours in Rakhine State supported the Japanese, and this in part led to their marginalisation in the wake of independence from Britain. So since then, the largely Buddhist government of Myanmar has refused to recognise the culture and identity of the Rohingya, and this has had really important implications for their sense of belonging and implications for citizenship and just how we respect ethnic diversity. So since independence, they've viewed the Rohingya as illegal migrants from Bangladesh. They don't recognise that the Rohingya is a distinct ethnic group. They've been viewed as extremists and outsiders and a threat to the security of Myanmar. And the response to the Rohingya has been quite hostile, and some of this has been driven through policy as well. So in 1982, for example, Myanmar passed a law that barred the Rohingya from a list of the 135 official ethnic groups, and this has the direct consequence of denying them citizenship at birth. So at that time, the Rohingya were forced to trade their citizenship cards from Myanmar for a temporary registration card, and that doesn't count as any sort of proof of citizenship. So if you think of the implications of that, that has massive implications for mobility. You know, if you can't prove your citizenship, it makes it really difficult to travel and move for employment opportunities. So despite the move towards democracy in Myanmar and equal rights in 2011, hostility towards the Rohingya, which is spearheaded by Buddhist nationalists, actually starts to increase. So while Myanmar is moving towards this democratic state, there is hostility towards this particular ethnic group. And this is in direct contrast to what a lot of the resistance towards the military actually stood for. You know, people who were involved in the resistance and who wanted to bring democracy to Myanmar during the dictatorship opposed that oppression of human rights and really wanted an equal society. So there's a contradiction here. It's also important to remember that this happens, you know, against a backdrop of lots of anti-Muslim sentiment. And this is part of like a broader discourse of Islamophobia that's occasioned in part by the war on terror. And in 2012, there's a really interesting example of the then president of Myanmar, who was reported to have suggested to the United Nations that an estimated 800,000 Rohingya refugees should be removed from the country. And that's a really interesting concept also, the use of the term refugees. These were residents and citizens, although not on paper, of Myanmar who had, you know, a long and deep ancestry there. Another interesting point that there's a growing reluctance during this time to actually use and acknowledge the term Rohingya in public discourse. So the Burmese majority adopts this term Kalar, which is used to label all Muslims, irrespective of their ethnicity in Myanmar. In 2014, the government decided to no longer include the Rohingya in census counting, and this is a further effort to dehumanise and deny their right to belong. So if you're not even counting the existence of people, you more or less deny them any sort of visibility whatsoever. And violence towards this ethnic minority increases. And before 2017, it was coded as a form of protection against Muslims. So those very familiar racist tropes that we hear across all societies, you know, the threat of large families, of intermarriage, and all of this, you know, the implication is that it would challenge the status quo. So the Rohingya, before 2016, 2017, are suffering from institutionalised discrimination that's based on ethnicity. So just to give you an example of the kind of restrictions and inequalities that exist. So there's restrictions on marriage. So if you are a Rohingya couple, you must seek permission to marry. Strict rules surrounding family planning. So the Rohingya must adhere to a 2-child policy. Employment opportunities were greatly reduced in Rakhine State. Education was restricted, religious practice was ostracised, and the freedom of movement was greatly curbed. Ethnic conflict comes to a head in 2016 and 2017. So tensions escalate when a resistance group known as the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army claimed responsibility for attacks on police and military posts in Rakhine State, and over 100 people die in this attack. So in response, the government prescribed this organisation, who want a separatist state for Rakhine State. They prescribed them as terrorists, and they begin rooting them out of Rakhine State. This involves a large-scale attack on Rohingya villages, and the UN calls this an example, a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, and it's condemned universally and globally. So hundreds and thousands of Rohingya flee into neighbouring Bangladesh almost overnight. And we are getting a sense of what that was like. Lots of censorship existed at that time in Myanmar, so it was sometimes difficult to get an understanding of what was happening at that particular time. But we've now got lots of refugee testimony that documents the extensive use of gendered violence against women, and the murder of Rohingya Muslim men in these villages. So I just kind of want to give you an example of the scale of that migration, and this is quite a good map that illustrates just where people went. So hundreds and thousands of refugees end up in Bangladesh, and those numbers are estimated to be somewhere between 700 and 900,000 people currently residing in camps in Bangladesh. So they make this journey on land. It's one of the land routes. They also go down into Malaysia in much smaller numbers, but still quite a sizable percentage. And some also use maritime routes to escape by sea. And just to note, an exodus on this scale has massive implications, massive societal implications, economic, cultural, and even environmental implications for the neighbouring states. And also lots of questions about how they could ever be repatriated into Rakhine State. Just, I wanted to include this example of a burnt out Rohingya village in Rakhine State. And just some diagrams and photographs that give you a bit more context here. So there is a diagram from the Human Rights Watch that details destroyed villages in Rakhine State over the course of a month in August-September 2017, and you'll see the red, just the sheer volume of villages that are destroyed in the first month of that government crackdown. And the other diagram looks at just the sheer volume of refugees, Rohingya refugees in camps in Bangladesh, and the UN has detailed lots of the challenges that this poses of sustaining these camps and getting clean water, sanitation, education, and any other sorts of rights under these camps. Just a picture of the camp in Bangladesh above there. So Myanmar's government have been heavily criticised by the outside world for the perceived genocide of the Rohingya, and some experts suggest that the inaction of Aung San Suu Kyi is a result of not wanting to alienate this Buddhist majority or threaten this delicate power sharing relationship between the military and civilians. Lots of people have also wanted to rescind Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel Prize for Peace also. I just wanted to show you some of these images, and this is from an artist project called Born Refugee, and this details the birth of babies in Cox's Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh. It's estimated that about 60 babies are born every day in this camp, and they are born stateless. So I've just included the link there also. So what has the UN's response to the crisis been? Well, the UN came down quite heavily and has been very, very critical of Myanmar's response to this crisis. So in 2017, the Secretary General described the Rohingya as one of, if not the most discriminated people in the world. Myanmar's leader suggested that the Western media had misunderstood the situation in Myanmar when she was brought before the Council in 2018 to answer claims of genocide. And while there has been some efforts and some discussions around repatriating Rohingya Muslims into Rakhine State, this remains very much an elusive request. So Rohingya Muslims do not feel that they will be safe in Rakhine State until there is more assurances given by the government to guarantee their safety. So just some concluding thoughts. A really interesting case study, I hope, for you. I think the case of the Rohingya Muslims underscores the continuing plight of ethnic minorities in societies where ethnic diversity is framed negatively. You know, it is one example of a society where ethnic diversity is not respected and where genocide and ethnic cleansing continues in our modern world. It shows how a disregard for ethnic diversity based on perceptions of the other can have important implications for stability. And I also think in this era of a global refugee crisis, this particular case study offers the potential to engage in a dialogue about how we respond to the challenges presented by enforced migration. There's quite a lot of good resources on this particular case study that I'm more than happy to share with you. I hope you find this interesting and it may give you some food for thought if we ever get back to normal again and start teaching in a way that we'd like to. Thank you for listening. Bye.